Late 1961. The air in the small wood-paneled study in Silver Spring, Maryland is thick with the scent of old paper, ink, and a quiet brewing storm. Outside, the world hums with the confident roar of post-war progress, a symphony of industry, innovation, and unwavering faith in chemical solutions. But inside this room, a different story is being meticulously typed onto the page, letter by painstaking letter. Marine biologist Rachel Carson, her brow furrowed in concentration, makes the final revisions to a manuscript that will become a declaration of war. This isn't a novel or a gentle nature guide like her previous bestsellers. This is an indictment. Her research, titled Silent Spring, is a 4-year culmination of relentless investigation, a mosaic pieced together from obscure scientific journals, letters from concerned citizens, and government reports that had been quietly ignored. It is a work of profound courage, compiled while she privately battled the cancer that would ultimately claim her life. The central villain of her story was a chemical compound known as dichlorodiphenyl trichloroethane, or DDT. To the public, DDT was a miracle. First synthesized in 1874, its insecticidal properties were discovered in 1939 by the Swiss chemist Paul Hermann Müller, a discovery that won him a Nobel Prize. During World War II, it was hailed as a savior, dusted over soldiers and civilians alike to kill lice and halt the spread of typhus, and sprayed across entire islands to eradicate the mosquitoes that carried malaria. After the war, this chemical weapon was domesticated. It was sold to the American public as a symbol of a clean, modern, pest-free life. Advertisements in popular magazines depicted smiling housewives spraying their roses, happy children playing in fields fogged by crop dusters. DDT and its chemical cousins, chlorinated hydrocarbons and organophosphates like dieldrin, aldrin, and parathion, became the invisible guardians of suburban lawns, bountiful harvests, and disease-free communities. They were cheap, they were effective, and their manufacturers, corporate giants like Monsanto, DuPont, and Velsicol, assured everyone they were perfectly safe. But Rachel Carson had uncovered a terrifying truth hidden in plain sight, a truth the chemical industry already knew from its own internal studies but had systematically concealed. These chemicals were not surgical strikes against pests, they were indiscriminate biological weapons. Carson's genius was not in discovering a single new fact, but in her synthesis of existing, fragmented evidence into a coherent, devastating narrative. She explained, in lyrical yet scientifically precise prose, the insidious mechanism of bioaccumulation. Unlike poisons that break down quickly, DDT was persistent. It lingered in the soil for years, washed into rivers, and settled in the sediment of lakes. There, it was absorbed by the smallest organisms, the plankton, the earthworms. When a small fish ate that plankton, the DDT from thousands of microscopic meals was concentrated in its fatty tissues. When a larger fish ate that small fish, the dose was magnified again. And when a bird, like an eagle or an osprey, ate that larger fish, it received a lethal concentration. Carson's manuscript detailed the horrifying consequences. She cited the work of ornithologists at Michigan State University who, in the mid-1950s, watched in alarm as the campus's vibrant robin population vanished. They had been spraying elm trees to combat Dutch elm disease. The poison dripped onto the leaves, which fell to the ground and were eaten by earthworms. The robins ate the worms and within days were found trembling, convulsing, and dying on the manicured lawns. This was the silent spring of her title, a future where the familiar chorus of birdsong had been replaced by an eerie, unnatural quiet. The poison was also thinning the eggshells of majestic predators, like the bald eagle, causing them to shatter in the nest. The very symbol of American strength was being rendered sterile by the chemical symbol of American progress. And the poison, she warned, did not stop with the birds. It was in the milk of cows that grazed on sprayed pastures. It was in the butter on the family dinner table. It was accumulating in the bodies of human beings, passed from mother to child in the womb, a chemical inheritance of unknown but deeply frightening potential. She drew direct lines to rising rates of liver disease and cancer, citing laboratory studies that showed these chemicals were potent carcinogens. She was challenging an entire paradigm, the arrogant belief that humanity could bend nature to its will with a chemical spray gun, without consequence. The chemical industry had built a multi-billion-dollar empire on the promise of a world without pests. Carson's manuscript argued that the price of this sterile perfection was the poisoning of the world itself. As she typed the final words, the weight of her discovery was immense. The manuscript was finished. It was a masterpiece of ecological science and a profound act of moral courage. But the forces it was about to confront were powerful, wealthy, and deeply entrenched in the political and economic fabric of the nation. The question wasn't if the world would listen, but if the corporate giants she was about to expose could silence her before the truth ever had a chance to take root. Following the initial whispers of Carson's explosive findings, which began with its serialization in magazine in June of 1962, the backlash was not just swift, it was a calculated, brutal, and deeply personal war. The chemical industry, which had for years dismissed environmental concerns as the ramblings of sentimental nature lovers, immediately recognized as an existential threat. This wasn't a fringe pamphlet. This was a meticulously researched work by a respected author and scientist, published in one of America's most prestigious magazines. They couldn't ignore it, so they set out to destroy its author. We can see the strategy laid out in archival industry memos and internal communications from the era. A memo from the Velsico Chemical Corporation, a major producer of pesticides like chlordane and heptachlor, is particularly chilling. It outlined a plan to portray Carson as a hysterical, unscientific woman, and it explicitly discussed the possibility of a libel lawsuit to intimidate her publisher, Houghton Mifflin. This wasn't a scientific debate. It was a character assassination funded by a war chest of millions. The National Agricultural Chemicals Association doubled its public relations budget overnight. Industry-funded scientists and spokespeople were dispatched to newspapers and television stations to paint Carson not as a scientist, but as a priestess of a nature cult. They attacked her credentials, conveniently ignoring her master's degree in zoology from Johns Hopkins and her 16 years as a scientist and editor for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. The attacks were steeped in the pervasive sexism of the early 1960s. A former Secretary of Agriculture, Ezra Taft Benson, wrote in a letter, "I thought she was a spinster. What's she so worried about genetics for?" The implication was clear. As a woman without children, her concerns about the future of humanity were somehow invalid. She was labeled an alarmist, emotional, and a bird and bunny lover. Monsanto, one of the primary manufacturers of DDT, went so far as to commission and distribute thousands of copies of a parody booklet titled The Desolate Year, which depicted a world ravaged by insect-borne plagues, all because meddling do-gooders had restricted pesticide use. Yet, through this storm of vitriol, Carson's scientific rigor was her shield and her sword. Her critics claimed she wanted to ban all pesticides and return humanity to the Dark Ages. But Carson never called for an outright ban. She called for responsible use, for an end to the indiscriminate, widespread spraying of persistent poisons. She advocated for an approach we now call integrated pest management, using biological controls and more targeted, less toxic chemicals. Her attackers tried to dismiss her claims as anecdotal, but her book was built on a foundation of over 50 pages of scientific citations. She meticulously detailed the mechanisms of bioaccumulation and biomagnification, concepts that were then new to the public but well established in the scientific literature. She presented case study after case study of ecological disaster. She wrote about Clear Lake, California, where a campaign to eradicate a harmless net with the pesticide DDT led to the poison concentrating in the lake's fish. The local population of western grebes, birds that ate those fish, was nearly wiped out. Autopsies revealed that the fat in their tissues contained DDT at levels 80,000 times higher than the concentration in the lake water. She documented the disastrous fire ant eradication program in the American South, where planes blanketed entire landscapes with dieldrin and heptachlor, killing not just fire ants, but countless birds, fish, livestock, and pets. Farmers reported their cows dying, their chickens unable to hatch eggs. The poison didn't respect property lines or species boundaries. It was a systemic assault. While the chemical company's PR machine churned out pamphlets depicting a world of progress and plenty, Carson's evidence painted a picture of a world slowly, silently being poisoned from within. The scientific community, though initially cautious under the immense pressure from industry and government funding agencies, began to rally behind her. The evidence was simply too overwhelming to ignore. Her calm, dignified, and fact-based response to the vicious attacks only served to highlight the vacuousness of her opponents' arguments. They attacked her gender, her personality, her motivations. She responded with data, with peer-reviewed studies, and with an unshakable moral clarity. The battle lines were drawn. On one side, a multi-billion-dollar industry with immense political power and a narrative of American progress. On the other, a quiet, ailing scientist armed with little more than the truth. How do you fight an entire industry's propaganda machine when it's dedicated to not just refuting your facts, but erasing your very credibility as a human being? Building on that unshakable scientific foundation, Rachel Carson did something her attackers never expected. She refused to be silenced. She took her case directly to the American people. The turning point came on April 3, 1963, when the television program aired a special titled The Silent Spring of Rachel Carson. In an era with only 3 major networks, the broadcast reached an audience of over 15 million people. Viewers saw not the hysterical alarmist depicted in corporate propaganda, but a calm, articulate, and deeply knowledgeable scientist. Seated opposite her were her chief detractors, including a spokesman for the chemical industry, Dr. Robert White Stevens, who, in a stark white lab coat, confidently declared that if humanity were to follow Carson's path, it would return to the Dark Ages and the insects and diseases and vermin would once again inherit the earth. But his bluster and dismissive tone paled in comparison to Carson's quiet authority. She methodically presented her evidence, explaining complex ecological concepts in clear, accessible language. The public saw the contrast: an industry defending its profits versus a scientist defending the planet. The broadcast was a public relations disaster for the chemical industry and a monumental victory for Carson. The momentum was now unstoppable. President John F. Kennedy, who had read after its serialization in MAG, ordered his President's Science Advisory Committee to investigate Carson's claims. In May 1963, the committee released its report. It was a complete and total vindication. The report confirmed the dangers of persistent pesticides, validated Carson's research, and called for stricter government regulation. The industry's central argument that Carson was an unscientific outlier was shattered. This official validation led directly to widespread government investigations. Carson, now severely weakened by breast cancer and the debilitating effects of radiation therapy, was called to testify before a Senate subcommittee chaired by Senator Abraham Ribicoff. Despite her physical fragility, her testimony was a masterclass in scientific communication and moral force. She spoke not with anger, but with a profound sense of urgency and responsibility. She argued that the core issue was humanity's newfound power to alter nature on a global scale, a power we were wielding with catastrophic recklessness. The ripple effect of her work was immense and transformative. ERA is widely credited with igniting the modern environmental movement. It shifted the conversation from a narrow focus on conservation, saving pretty parks and charismatic animals, to a deeper understanding of ecology, the interconnectedness of all life, and the systemic threats posed by industrial pollution. Grassroots organizations, inspired by her courage, sprang up across the country, demanding government action. This groundswell of public pressure, born from the pages of her book, led directly to the most significant environmental legislation in American history. Her work laid the foundation for the creation of the Environmental Protection Agency in 1970, a federal body with the power to regulate pollutants, a direct answer to the systemic failure she had so brilliantly exposed. And in 1972, 8 years after her death, the EPA enacted a nationwide ban on DDT for agricultural use, the very chemical at the heart of her investigation. Rachel Carson died in 1964, just 2 years after ERA was published. She never lived to see the creation of the EPA or the ban on DDT. She never witnessed the global environmental awakening she had sparked. Her legacy is a powerful testament to the impact one individual can have against seemingly insurmountable odds. She faced down a corporate Goliath, endured vicious personal attacks, and battled a terminal illness, all while fighting for a truth she knew was essential for the survival of the planet. Her story forces us to ask the hard questions. Who signs the patents for poisons, and whose names vanish from the essential warnings? Whose profits are protected and whose health is sacrificed? Rachel Carson's courageous fight reminds us that the battle for scientific truth against corporate power is a battle that never ends, and that remembering her struggle is not just an act of historical justice, it is an essential tool for protecting our world today.